My name is Yvonne, and at 54 years old, I thought I understood grief. Standing beside my husband Robert's casket, watching the rain streak down the funeral home windows, I felt the weight of 32 years of marriage settling on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. The cancer had taken him slowly, and I'd spent 2 years watching the man I loved fade away. But grief, I was learning, has many faces. Some you expect, like the hollow ache in your chest when you wake up reaching for someone who's no longer there. Others blindside you completely, like overhearing your daughter-in-law whisper to her friend that you need to be gone by morning so they can start house renovations. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt overlooked by family, and don't forget to subscribe because this story has a twist that'll restore your faith in justice. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. Robert and I met during my junior year at University of Michigan back in 1990. He was this tall, lanky engineering student who spent more time in the library than most people spent sleeping. I was studying elementary education, dreaming of teaching third graders, and maybe having a family of my own someday. Our first date was at a little diner called Mel's near campus, where he nervously spilled coffee on his textbook while trying to impress me with calculus jokes. I should have known then that he'd always be a little clumsy when he cared about something deeply. We married 2 years after graduation in June of 1992. Robert landed a job with Ford Motor Company, and I started teaching at Riverside Elementary. We rented a tiny apartment in Dearborn, at first saving every penny we could toward buying our own place. Those early years were tight financially, but we were building something together. Every evening we'd spread out real estate listings on our kitchen table, circling houses we couldn't afford yet, but dreaming about the day we could. In 1995, we finally found our home, a 3-bedroom colonial in the suburbs of Detroit with a big front yard and an oak tree that was already 50 years old. The mortgage payments stretched us thin, but Robert worked overtime at Ford while I took on summer tutoring jobs. We painted every room ourselves, planted a garden in the backyard, and slowly turned that house into our sanctuary. Michael arrived in February of 1998 after 3 years of trying and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages. He was perfect, all 10 fingers and 10 toes, with Robert's dark hair and my stubborn chin. We poured everything we had into raising him right. Robert coached his Little League team every Saturday for 6 years. I helped with homework every night, drove him to piano lessons, attended every school play and science fair. Michael excelled at everything he touched. High school valedictorian, full scholarship to Michigan State for computer science, then a master's degree and a job at a tech company in Ann Arbor. We were so proud of the man he'd become, smart, ambitious, kind-hearted. Or so I thought. He met Stephanie in 2018 at a company mixer. She worked in marketing for a different tech firm, all sharp suits and perfectly styled blonde hair, beautiful, confident, and about as warm as a January morning in Detroit. Their relationship moved fast, engaged after 8 months, married in September 2020 during the pandemic. We'd hoped for a big celebration, but COVID restrictions meant a small ceremony with just immediate family. From the beginning, something about Stephanie rubbed me wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. She was always polite, always said the right things, but there was a calculating quality to her kindness. During family dinners, she'd make comments about our house being so spacious for just 2 people, or wonder aloud if we'd ever considered downsizing to something more manageable. When Robert and I would exchange glances across the table, she'd quickly add, "Of course you've earned the right to enjoy your beautiful home. I just worry about all the maintenance as you get older." Sweet words with a bitter aftertaste. The first real red flag came during Christmas 2021. Stephanie spent the entire visit taking pictures of our living room, kitchen, and master bedroom. When I asked what the photos were for, she laughed and said she was documenting family memories. But I noticed she focused more on the crown molding and hardwood floors than on any family moments. Then in March 2022, everything changed. Robert started coughing during breakfast one morning, a dry hack that wouldn't go away. 2 weeks later, the diagnosis came back: stage 3 lung cancer. My world shifted on its axis in that sterile doctor's office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while an oncologist explained treatment options and survival rates. I quit my teaching job immediately. After 26 years at Riverside Elementary, walking away from my classroom and my kids felt like losing a piece of myself. But Robert needed me, and nothing else mattered. The next 2 years became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, radiation treatments, and sleepless nights monitoring his breathing. Michael and Stephanie visited less frequently after the diagnosis, always with good excuses, work projects, Stephanie's yoga classes, weekend trips they'd already planned. When they did come by, I noticed Stephanie's eyes wandering around our home differently. She'd run her fingers along the granite countertops we'd installed 5 years earlier, comment on the excellent natural lighting in the master suite, or mention how our neighborhood had really appreciated in value lately. During those final months of Robert's life, I lived in a strange twilight world where time moved differently. Days blurred together in a rhythm of medications, doctor appointments, and small moments of tenderness stolen between the pain. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning to check his breathing, adjust his pillows, or help him to the bathroom. Some nights when the morphine made him restless, I'd read aloud from his favorite Tom Clancy novels until dawn. Robert had always been a private man, especially about business matters, but the cancer seemed to make him more secretive. In October 2024, about 3 weeks before he passed, I noticed him making hushed phone calls from his study. When I'd walk in with his afternoon tea, he'd quickly hang up and smile that gentle smile that had charmed me for over 3 decades. "Just handling some paperwork, sweetheart," he'd say, shuffling documents into manila folders. "Nothing for you to worry about." One afternoon, while Robert napped upstairs, I answered the landline in the kitchen. A man's voice asked for Robert Patterson, and when I said he was resting, the caller identified himself as Mark Patterson from Patterson Legal Services. "No relation, just an unfortunate coincidence of names," he explained with a chuckle. "I've been working with your husband on updating some important documents," he said. "Could you have him call me when he's feeling up to it? It's regarding the revisions we discussed last week." I jotted down the message, curious, but not wanting to pry. Robert had always handled our legal affairs from refinancing the house to setting up our basic wills years ago. I figured he was just being responsible, making sure everything was in order for whatever came next. But then I started noticing other things. Michael's phone calls became more frequent, but they were brief, almost businesslike. When he'd visit, he'd spend more time in Robert's study than at his father's bedside. I'd catch him examining our family photos, but not with nostalgia, more like he was taking inventory. One evening in late October, I was folding laundry in our bedroom when I overheard Michael talking on his cell phone in the hallway. His voice carried through the thin walls of our 1950s colonial. "The property's easily worth $800,000 in today's market," he was saying. "Maybe more with some updates. The location alone is prime real estate." A pause then. "No, she has no idea about property values. Mom's always been naive about money." My hands stilled on Robert's flannel shirts. Who was he talking to about our house's value? And why did it matter while his father lay dying just down the hall? The phone conversation continued. Stephanie ran the comparables. Similar houses in the neighborhood sold for between $750 and $825 last month. We're talking about serious money here. I set down the laundry basket and crept closer to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. This felt wrong, like eavesdropping on strangers discussing someone else's life. "Look, I love my mom, but she can't manage a house this size alone. Dad's medical bills probably wiped out most of their savings anyway. The responsible thing would be to sell and help her find something smaller, more affordable." The casual way he discussed dismantling my life, while Robert fought for every breath in the next room, made my knees weak. I sank onto the edge of our bed, clutching one of Robert's shirts to my chest. 3 days later, Robert called me to his bedside with unusual urgency. His breathing was labored, but his eyes held a clarity I hadn't seen in weeks. "Yvonne, honey, I need you to listen carefully," he whispered, taking my hand in both of his. His fingers felt papery and cold. "I've made some changes to our legal documents. Important changes. If anything happens to me, and anyone tries to tell you different, remember that I made sure you're protected." "Robert, what are you talking about? You're scaring me." He squeezed my hand tighter. "Our safety deposit box at First National, Box 347. the keys in my desk drawer taped under the bottom of the middle one. Promise me you'll remember that. I promise, but why can't you just tell me what this is about? His eyes grew heavy with exhaustion and something that looked like sadness. Because I heard things I shouldn't have heard. Phone conversations about our house, our money. I know what they're planning, sweetheart, and I couldn't let it happen. 2 weeks later, on the morning of November 15th, I woke up to silence. No labored breathing, no restless movement beside me. Robert had passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand still resting on my shoulder. The man who'd shared my bed for 32 years, who'd painted our first apartment's kitchen bright yellow, because it made me smile, who'd held me through 2 miscarriages, and celebrated every small victory in our son's life, was gone. The next 48 hours passed in a haze of phone calls to the funeral home, the church, the cemetery. Michael and Stephanie arrived that evening, but instead of grief, they seemed to radiate nervous energy. While I sat numbly in Robert's chair, still wearing the same clothes I'd slept in, they busied themselves with practical matters. "Mom, we need to start thinking about arrangements," Michael said, sitting across from me in our living room. "Not just the funeral, but afterward, long-term planning." Stephanie nodded sympathetically, perched on the edge of our sofa like she might need to make a quick escape. "Grief can make it hard to think clearly about the future. We want to help you through this transition." Transition? The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was still burning. The funeral took place on a gray Thursday morning at St. Patrick's Catholic Church, where Robert and I had been married 32 years earlier. The same pews where we'd sat every Sunday for decades, the same altar where we'd baptized Michael, the same stained glass windows that had watched our family grow and now witnessed our first goodbye. 150 people came to say farewell to Robert. His co-workers from Ford Neighbors who'd borrowed tools and shared Labor Day barbecues, teachers I'd worked with for over 2 decades, Michael's high school friends who still remembered the man who'd coached them through championship seasons. The outpouring of love should have comforted me, but I felt disconnected from it all, like I was watching someone else's grief through thick glass. Father Martinez delivered a beautiful homily about Robert's devotion to family and community. He spoke about the vegetables Robert donated to the church food bank every summer from our garden, the way he'd quietly paid for car repairs when unemployed parishioners couldn't afford them, his gentle humor and unwavering integrity. Michael gave a eulogy that brought tears to many eyes, talking about weekend fishing trips and bedtime stories, the way his father had taught him to change a tire and balance a checkbook and treat women with respect. Listening to my son speak, I almost forgot the phone conversation. I'd overheard the calculating looks, the whispered discussions about property values. But Stephanie reminded me. Throughout the service, she seemed restless, checking her phone during prayers, taking selfies during the procession to the cemetery. When people approached to offer condolences, she'd glance at her watch or scan the crowd like she was looking for someone more important to talk to. At the burial, as dirt fell onto Robert's casket with soft thuds that echoed in my chest, I excused myself to use the restroom in the cemetery's small chapel. The ladies' room was tucked behind the main sanctuary, and as I walked back toward the graveside, I heard familiar voices coming from a side corridor. "Finally!" Stephanie was saying, her voice bright with excitement that made my stomach turn. "This old house is worth at least $800,000. She needs to be gone by morning so we can start renovations. The kitchen's completely outdated, but the bones are solid. We could flip it for over $1 million after updates." I pressed myself against the chapel wall, hidden by shadows, my heart hammering so loud I was afraid they'd hear it. Michael's voice joined hers. "Mom doesn't understand real estate value. She's been stuck in teacher mode for 30 years thinking small. She can find a nice senior apartment somewhere, maybe near that community college where she used to volunteer, somewhere more appropriate for her age and situation." "How long do you think it'll take to get her out?" Stephanie asked. "I already contacted Jessica Morrison from Coldwell Banker. She says with the right staging we could have showings within 2 weeks. We'll give her the weekend to process everything, then sit her down on Monday. Be gentle but firm. Frame it as what Dad would have wanted, looking out for her best interests." Their voices grew fainter as they moved away, discussing contractors and renovation budgets, while I stood frozen in that dim corridor, Robert's funeral flowers still fresh in my trembling hands. When I finally returned to the graveside, the service was ending. People hugged me, promised to call, invited me for dinner once I was ready. Their kindness felt surreal against the backdrop of what I'd just heard. As the crowd dispersed, Michael and Stephanie flanked me solicitously, guiding me toward their car with the practiced efficiency of people executing a well-rehearsed plan. "Let us drive you home, Mom," Michael said, taking my elbow. "You shouldn't be alone right now." But I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by people who were already planning my exile. That night they insisted on staying over to keep me company. I lay in the bed Robert and I had shared for nearly 3 decades, listening to their voices drifting up from the living room below. They weren't discussing grief or memories or how to honor Robert's legacy. They were talking square footage and market comparisons and something called estate maximization. Around midnight, their conversation turned to timelines. "The lawyer said the will reading is scheduled for Monday morning," Michael was saying. "Once that's done and the house officially transfers, we can start moving quickly." "What if she fights us on it?" Stephanie asked. "She won't. Mom's always been a follower, not a leader. Dad made all the financial decisions. She's probably terrified of handling any of this alone. We're offering her a solution." I pulled my pillow over my head, trying to block out their voices, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I lay there remembering Robert's last coherent words about changes to our legal documents, about protection, about a safety deposit box I'd never heard of before. In the darkness of our bedroom, surrounded by 30 years of shared memories, I began to understand that my real battle was just beginning. The next morning arrived with the kind of artificial brightness that follows a storm, sunlight streaming through windows like nothing had changed. I was in the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making coffee, when Stephanie knocked on my bedroom door at exactly 7 a.m. Her voice carried that practiced sympathy I'd grown to recognize over the past 2 years. "Morning, Mom. Can we talk?" I made some tea. I found them both in my living room, Michael sitting in Robert's chair, while Stephanie perched on the edge of the sofa with a manila folder in her lap. They'd clearly been up early, probably rehearsing this conversation like actors preparing for opening night. "We know this is incredibly difficult timing," Stephanie began, her voice soft and measured. "But we need to discuss some practical arrangements. About the house, about your future." She opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper, spreading them on the coffee table like she was dealing cards. "We've been doing some research, and Michael's right about this place being too big for one person. The maintenance alone could become overwhelming." Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest and concerned. "Mom, we found this amazing senior community in Rochester Hills. Independent living, but with support services if you need them. There's even an art studio and a library. You'd love it." "The best part," Stephanie continued, "is that it's completely affordable once we handle the estate properly. Dad left everything to the family, which means we can liquidate the assets and set up a comfortable trust fund for your retirement." She slid a photocopy across the table toward me. 2 pages typed on official-looking letterhead with Robert's signature at the bottom. "This is Dad's will. Pretty straightforward. The house, the savings account, the life insurance policy, everything goes to Michael as the surviving heir with provisions for your care." I picked up the papers with hands that barely trembled, though my entire body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency only dogs could hear. The document looked legitimate enough, but something felt wrong about the weight of it, the thinness. Robert had always been thorough about paperwork, sometimes obsessively so. "Where did you get this?" I asked quietly. "From Dad's desk," Michael said. "He had it filed under important documents just like he always did." "We need to be realistic about timing," Stephanie added, consulting her phone. "The housing market is really strong right now, but that could change. If we list the property within the next 2 weeks, we could probably get close to asking price." 2 weeks. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. Michael's expression shifted to something more patronizing. "Mom, I know this feels rushed, but Dad would want us to be smart about this. You're 54, still young enough to start over somewhere new. Stephanie and I, we have kids to think about." He gestured toward his wife's still flat stomach. "This baby will need a college fund, and the equity in this house could secure that future." "We already contacted Three Brothers Moving Company," Stephanie said, sliding a business card across the table. They specialize in senior relocations. Very gentle, very professional. They'll pack everything for you, store what you want to keep, and donate the rest. It's actually quite liberating starting fresh without all the clutter of the past. Clutter. She was calling 32 years of marriage of memories of carefully chosen furniture and wedding gifts, and Michael's childhood artwork still magneted to the refrigerator clutter. "I need time to think about this," I said, standing up abruptly. "This is all happening very fast." Michael stood too, moving closer with that concerned expression that had once comforted me when he was small and scraped his knee or had nightmares. "Of course you need time. We're not trying to pressure you. But Mom, you have to understand Dad's gone now. The practical decisions can't wait forever." "He's right," Stephanie said, gathering the papers back into her folder. "Grief can make it hard to see the bigger picture, but we're here to help you navigate this transition. That's what family does." After they left to give me space to process, I sat alone in Robert's chair, staring at the coffee table where they'd spread out my future like a real estate brochure. The house felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a crime scene where something precious had been murdered. But Robert's voice echoed in my memory. "I made sure you're protected." I walked to his study, a small room off the kitchen that had always been his private domain. His desk was a massive oak piece we'd bought at an estate sale 20 years ago, solid and dependable like the man who'd used it. The middle drawer stuck slightly the way it always had, and I had to jiggle it just right to get it open. My fingers found the key immediately taped exactly where Robert had said it would be. Small and silver, with a number engraved on the head, 347. As I held that key in my palm, feeling its weight, I realized that my husband had known this day would come. Somehow he'd seen the calculation in our son's eyes, the greed masquerading as concern, the plans being made around our kitchen table while he lay dying upstairs. And he'd done something about it. First National Bank opened its doors at 9 a.m. sharp, and I was waiting in the parking lot at 8:45, clutching that small silver key like a lifeline. The safety deposit box area was in the basement, all fluorescent lighting and beige walls that made everything feel official and slightly ominous. Box 347 was in the middle section, requiring both my key and the bank's master key to open. Inside, I found a manila envelope thick with documents, a small velvet jewelry box I'd never seen before, and a sealed letter with my name written in Robert's careful handwriting. My hands shook as I opened the letter first. "My dearest Yvonne, if you're reading this, then they tried to do exactly what I was afraid they'd do. I heard Michael on the phone 3 weeks ago talking to Stephanie about managing Mom's transition and maximizing the estate value. The way he spoke about you, about our home, about our life together, broke something in me that the cancer couldn't touch. I've spent the last month working with Mark Patterson to make absolutely certain that you're protected. Everything we built together stays yours for as long as you want it. Michael will get his inheritance someday, but only if he learns to respect the woman who gave him life and the home where he grew up safe and loved. The jewelry box contains your grandmother's ring, the one you thought was lost in the move 15 years ago. I had it reset as a surprise for our next anniversary. Now it's my final gift to you, along with the security of knowing that no one can take away what's rightfully yours. I love you, Yvonne. Fight for yourself the way you fought for me during these last 2 years. Always yours, Robert." I opened the velvet box with trembling fingers and found my grandmother's sapphire ring, the one that had been missing from my jewelry box for so long I'd stopped looking for it. The stone caught the fluorescent light, throwing tiny blue sparkles across the bank's sterile walls, and I nearly broke down right there in that basement room. But the legal documents demanded my attention. 15 pages, not 2. Notarized, witnessed, dated October 30th, 2024. Just 2 weeks before Robert died. My name appeared on every page, sometimes highlighted in yellow, sometimes underlined in Robert's firm handwriting. The language was complex, but the meaning was crystal clear. 90% of everything we owned was mine outright. The house, the savings account, the life insurance policy, even Robert's pension benefits. Michael would inherit 10% immediately and the rest only upon my death, or if I chose to transfer ownership voluntarily. But there was more. A clause I had to read 3 times to believe, in the event that the primary beneficiary, Yvonne Patterson, is subjected to coercion, fraud, or manipulation regarding the distribution of assets, the secondary beneficiary's inheritance shall be reduced to 5%, with the remainder designated for charitable organizations of the primary beneficiary's choosing. Robert had built-in protection against exactly what was happening upstairs in my living room. A separate document detailed our financial situation with devastating precision. Far from being wiped out by medical bills, we were actually in excellent shape. Robert's life insurance policy through Ford had covered most of the cancer treatments, and our savings account contained nearly $150,000. The house was worth exactly what Michael and Stephanie had estimated, maybe more. I sat in that small basement room surrounded by the evidence of my husband's final act of love and felt something I hadn't experienced since his diagnosis power. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and appointments. Mark Patterson agreed to see me that afternoon at 2 p.m. I drove home where Michael and Stephanie were waiting in my kitchen, takeout containers from that expensive sushi place downtown spread across my table like they'd already moved in. "There she is," Stephanie said brightly. "We were worried when we couldn't find you. How are you feeling about everything we discussed this morning?" "Still processing," I said carefully. "But I did want to ask you something. This will you showed me, where exactly did you find it?" Michael gestured vaguely toward Robert's study. "In his desk, like I said, filed under important documents." "And you're certain this is the most recent version?" Stephanie and Michael exchanged a quick glance so fast I almost missed it. "Of course," Stephanie said. "Why would there be multiple versions? Your husband was very organized about legal matters." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "You're right. He was very organized." That afternoon, Mark Patterson's office felt like a sanctuary. A small practice in downtown Rochester filled with law books and family photos, and the kind of comfortable, lived-in atmosphere that suggested integrity. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, rising from behind his desk to shake my hand, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your husband was a good man who loved you very much." "Thank you. I think we need to discuss the documents you prepared for him." Mark's expression grew serious as I told him about the will Michael and Stephanie had shown me, about their plans for the house, about the timeline they'd laid out for my transition. "Mrs. Patterson," he said when I finished, "the document you described bears no resemblance to what your husband and I created together. What you're describing sounds like a forgery." He pulled out a thick file and spread the real will across his desk, side by side, with photocopies I'd made of Michael and Stephanie's version. The differences were stark and undeniable. "We need to talk about your options," Mark said, "and we need to talk about them quickly before they attempt to file any fraudulent paperwork with the court." The confrontation I'd been planning took shape over the next 24 hours, with Mark Patterson's careful guidance. We agreed that simply revealing the truth wouldn't be enough. If Michael and Stephanie were willing to forge a will and pressure me to sign away my home, they needed to understand that actions have consequences. "They'll likely try to get you to sign additional documents," Mark warned during our strategy session Friday morning. "Powers of attorney property transfers, anything to legitimize their position. We need to let them show their hand completely before we play ours." Saturday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for November in Michigan, the kind of false spring day that makes you believe winter might hold off just a little longer. Michael called at 8 a.m. to arrange a family meeting for 10 o'clock. "We've set up an appointment with a legal advisor," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Someone who can walk you through the estate process step by step, make sure everything's handled properly." "That's very thoughtful," I replied, meaning every word in ways he couldn't imagine. They picked me up in Stephanie's white BMW, the same car she'd used to take photos of my house's exterior last Christmas. The conversation during the 20-minute drive stayed deliberately light. Michael talked about work projects, Stephanie mentioned baby preparations, and I listened with the kind of detached interest you might show to strangers discussing their vacation plans. The coffee shop they'd chosen was a generic chain in a strip mall, the kind of place you'd pick if you wanted to avoid being recognized by anyone who might matter. David Kim was waiting for us at a corner table, a thin young man in an ill-fitting suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, standing to shake my hand, "I'm sorry for your loss. Estate planning can seem overwhelming, but we'll walk through everything step by step. For the next hour, David guided me through a series of documents that would have effectively stripped me of everything Robert and I had built together. Property transfer forms, financial power of attorney agreements, even pre-signed contracts with Three Brothers Moving Company and Coldwell Banker Real Estate. "This seems like a lot of paperwork," I said, setting down the pen they'd provided. "I'm not sure I understand all the implications." Stephanie leaned forward, her voice warm with manufactured concern. "That's exactly why David's here to help. Sometimes the legal language can be confusing, but he's explained that this is all standard procedure for estate settlement." "The important thing," Michael added, "is that we're protecting you from having to deal with all these details yourself. Once the paperwork's filed, everything becomes much simpler." David nodded enthusiastically. "Your son's absolutely right. Estate administration can be complex and stressful, especially during the grieving process. These documents streamline everything." I picked up the pen again, holding it poised over the signature line on the property transfer form. My hand was steady now, no trembling, no uncertainty. "Before I sign anything this important, I should probably have my own legal counsel review these documents." The temperature at our table seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mom," Michael said carefully, "that's just going to complicate things unnecessarily. David's a qualified professional who specializes in estate law. Adding another lawyer into the mix will delay everything and cost money we don't need to spend. Plus," Stephanie added, checking her watch, "we have appointments scheduled with contractors next week. The renovation timeline is pretty tight if we want to maximize the spring selling season." "I understand," I said, setting the pen down again. "But I'd still like to have someone review everything. Actually, I've already arranged for representation." As if summoned by divine timing, Mark Patterson appeared beside our table, briefcase in hand, and the kind of confident smile that comes from 30 years of practicing law. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," he said, extending his hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the coffee shop's worn carpet. Michael's face went through several interesting color changes, while Stephanie looked like she was trying to solve a complex math problem in her head. David Kim appeared to be seriously considering making a run for the exit. "Allow me to introduce myself," Mark continued, addressing the table with professional courtesy. "Mark Patterson, Patterson Legal Services. No relation to my client here, just an unfortunate coincidence of names. I've been handling the Patterson family's estate planning for the past several years." He opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder, placing it on the table with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested he'd done this many times before. "I believe there may be some confusion regarding Mr. Robert Patterson's final will and testament." Mark set his tone conversational, but carrying an underlying steel that made everyone sit up straighter. Would this be a good time to clarify the actual contents of the legal documents? David Kim's face had gone pale enough to match his poorly pressed white shirt. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here. We're just helping Mrs. Patterson with some basic estate paperwork." "Are you a licensed attorney, Mr. Kim?" Mark asked politely. "I'm a paralegal with extensive experience in estate administration," David replied, the confidence draining from his voice like air from a punctured tire. "Interesting, because representing yourself as legal counsel when you're not a licensed attorney is a serious matter in Michigan, as is preparing fraudulent estate documents." Mark opened his folder and removed the real will, 15 pages of carefully crafted legal language that represented Robert's true final wishes. He placed it beside the photocopied fraud Michael and Stephanie had been carrying around like a magic trick. "Mrs. Patterson," Mark said, "would you like me to read the actual provisions of your husband's will aloud, or would you prefer to handle this privately?" The fight went out of Michael and Stephanie simultaneously, like someone had flipped a switch. Stephanie slumped back in her chair while Michael stared at the real will with the expression of a man watching his lottery ticket numbers come up wrong. "I think," I said, standing up and gathering the fraudulent documents they'd tried to make me sign, "that we should handle this privately. But first, I want to make something very clear to both of you." I looked directly at my son. This man I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through countless childhood illnesses, cheered for at every baseball game and graduation ceremony. "Your father and I spent 32 years building a life together. This house isn't just real estate to be liquidated. It's the place where you took your first steps, where we nursed you through chickenpox, where you brought your prom date to meet us." Michael opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand. "I heard you at the funeral planning my eviction while dirt was still falling on your father's casket. I heard you dismiss our marriage, our home, our life together as obstacles to your investment strategy, and now you've attempted to defraud me using forged documents and a fake legal advisor." Stephanie found her voice first. "We were just trying to help you transition to a more manageable living situation. By lying to me, by forging legal documents, by pressuring me to sign away everything your father-in-law worked his entire life to provide," Mark cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Patterson, would you like me to contact the police regarding the attempted fraud, or would you prefer to handle this as a family matter?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was finally burning itself out. "You have 24 hours, I said quietly, "to remove your belongings from my house. After that, you're not welcome there again, unless I specifically invite you." Michael finally found his voice. "Mom, you don't understand. We were trying to protect you from making poor financial decisions." "No," I replied, slipping my grandmother's sapphire ring onto my finger for the first time in 15 years. "You were trying to protect yourselves from having to wait for your inheritance. There's a difference." The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of grief and liberation, like walking through a house after a hurricane has passed, surveying the damage while marveling at what survived intact. Michael and Stephanie collected their belongings the next morning, while I was at my grief support group meeting, leaving behind only a brief note, apologizing for any misunderstanding, and promising to give me space to heal. The grief support group met Tuesday evenings in the basement of Grace Lutheran Church, a circle of folding chairs occupied by people who understood that loss comes in many forms. There was Margaret, whose husband of 45 years had died in a car accident; Tom, whose daughter had been killed by a drunk driver; Sarah, whose son had overdosed on fentanyl-laced pills he'd thought were prescription painkillers; and now me mourning not just my husband's death, but the discovery that the son I'd raised had been willing to steal my security for his own financial gain. Betrayal complicates grief, our group facilitator Dr. Rebecca Chen explained during my third session. When someone dies, we expect to feel sadness, anger, even relief if they'd been suffering. But when someone we trusted tries to harm us during our most vulnerable time, it adds layers that can be difficult to process. I started attending twice-weekly sessions, then began volunteering to help set up the meeting space and organize resources for new members. Something about helping other people navigate their darkest moments gave my own pain a sense of purpose. At home, I began the slow process of reclaiming my space. I rearranged the living room furniture, donating the chair Michael had claimed as his during visits, and replacing it with a reading nook by the window overlooking Robert's garden. I painted the guest bedroom a soft lavender, a color I'd always loved, but Robert had found too feminine for his taste. The garden became my sanctuary. Robert had always been the gardener in our family, coaxing tomatoes and zucchini and herbs from the Michigan soil with the same patience he'd brought to everything else in life. I'd helped with weeding and watering, but the planning and planting had been his domain. That first spring after his death, I found myself spending hours among the raised beds, learning through trial and error which plants thrived in which locations, slowly developing my own relationship with the earth that had been Robert's joy. When the first tomatoes ripened in July, I cried over their perfect red abundance, tasting summer and memory and the continuity of life in every bite. Michael called 3 times during those first months, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly desperate as he realized I wasn't going to change my mind about their behavior. The messages followed a predictable pattern: initial attempts to minimize what had happened, followed by accusations that I was being unreasonable, then promises that Stephanie had been the mastermind and he'd simply been led astray. I listened to each message once, then deleted it. My grief counselor had warned me about this phase, the attempts to rewrite history and shift responsibility. Some bridges, she'd said, can be rebuilt after they burn. Others are meant to stay broken. In August, I received a birth announcement in the mail. Michael David Patterson, Jr., born August 15th, 7 pounds 4 ounces, perfectly healthy. No note, No invitation to meet my grandson, just a formal card with statistics and a professional photograph of a baby who looked exactly like Michael had at that age. I sat in my kitchen holding that card and remembering the night Michael was born, the way Robert had cried when the nurse placed our son in his arms for the first time. How we'd spent hours just staring at this tiny person we'd created, making plans for his future and promises about the kind of parents we'd be. Every ending, Dr. Chen had told our group, contains the seeds of a new beginning. Sometimes we can't see them right away, but they're always there waiting for the right conditions to grow. 6 months after Robert's funeral, I ran into my former principal, Linda Morrison, at the farmer's market downtown. We'd worked together for 15 years before my retirement to care for Robert, and seeing her familiar face in that crowded marketplace felt like finding an old friend after a long journey. "Yvonne," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like the lavender soap she'd always used. "How are you holding up? I heard about Robert, and I'm so sorry." We talked for over an hour, catching up on school gossip and retirement plans, and the strange experience of rebuilding life after profound loss. When she mentioned that the district was looking for substitute teachers for the fall semester, something stirred in my chest that felt like possibility. "I might be interested," I heard myself saying. "Part-time, maybe just a few days a week." "The kids would love you," Linda said. "And honestly, you'd be doing us a favor. Good substitute teachers are impossible to find these days." That September, I walked back into a third-grade classroom for the first time in over 2 years. The smell of crayon shavings and fresh paper, the chaos of 22 8-year-olds trying to remember where they'd put their homework, the pure joy on a child's face when a difficult math problem suddenly made sense, all of it felt like coming home to a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. Teaching had always been more than a job for me. It was a calling, a chance to shape young minds during those crucial early years when everything seems possible and the world still holds infinite promise. Being back in a classroom even temporarily reminded me that I was more than someone's wife or mother or victim of their greed. I was myself with value and purpose that existed independently of my relationships with others. By winter, I'd established a routine that felt sustainable and fulfilling. Teaching 3 days a week, volunteering at the animal shelter on weekends, attending grief support group meetings, and slowly expanding my social circle beyond the couple's friends Robert and I had shared. I joined a book club at the library, took a pottery class at the community center, and started attending concerts at the local music venue where younger performers played songs I'd never heard but somehow understood. The house that Michael and Stephanie had seen as an investment opportunity became my haven, filled with the sounds and smells and rhythms of a life being rebuilt, one day at a time. I adopted a senior dog from the shelter, a gentle golden retriever mix named Charlie, who'd been surrendered when his previous owner moved to assisted living. Together we walked through my neighborhood every morning, greeting other dog walkers and early commuters with the kind of casual friendliness that builds community one conversation at a time. Some days were harder than others. Anniversaries and holidays, the first time I had to call a plumber because the kitchen sink was leaking, moments when I'd turn to share some small observation with Robert before remembering he wasn't there. But even the difficult days held their own quiet victories, problems solved independently, tears shed without shame, the gradual understanding that I could miss my husband deeply while still building a meaningful life without him. The greatest surprise was how much I enjoyed my own company. After 32 years of marriage and 26 years of teaching, of always being needed by someone else, the luxury of making decisions based solely on my own preferences felt almost revolutionary. Dinner at 5:30, because that's when I felt hungry, not because someone else expected it. Lavender walls and classical music, and afternoon naps in the sunshine streaming through windows I could leave uncovered because no one else was affected by my choices. On the anniversary of Robert's death, I visited his grave with flowers from the garden we'd planted together, now thriving under my sole care. The headstone was simple gray granite with his name dates and the inscription, "Beloved Husband and Father." Looking at it, I realized that while those words captured important truths about who he'd been, they didn't tell the whole story. He'd also been a protector, someone who'd seen danger approaching and taken steps to shield me from it, even as cancer was stealing his strength. His final gift hadn't just been financial security. It had been the reminder that I deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, even by people who claimed to love me. Standing there in this late November cold, I made Robert a promise I would honor his memory by living fully, by refusing to let anyone make me smaller or less than I was, by building a life worthy of the love and protection he'd provided. The snow began falling as I walked back to my car, soft flakes that caught the afternoon light like tiny pieces of hope drifting down from a sky that held infinite possibilities. I drove home through streets I'd traveled for decades, past the elementary school where I'd taught countless children to read and write and believe in themselves, past the library where I'd discovered new worlds in books, past the church where Robert and I had pledged to love each other through whatever came. At home, Charlie greeted me with the unbridled enthusiasm that only dogs can manage, as if my return from a 30-minute absence was the best thing that had happened all day. I made myself a cup of tea, settled into my reading chair by the window, and opened the novel my book club was discussing next week. Outside, the snow continued falling on the garden Robert had planted, and I was learning to tend, covering everything in a clean white blanket that would protect the dormant plants through winter's harsh months. Come spring, they would emerge again stronger for having survived the cold, ready to bloom in abundance, just like me. The phone rang once that evening, Michael's number appearing on the caller ID. For a moment I considered answering, wondered if enough time had passed for genuine reconciliation, if becoming a father had taught him anything about the depth of parental love and sacrifice. But then I remembered the sound of his voice planning my eviction while his father's body was still warm, the casual cruelty of discussing my future like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving respect. Some betrayals I'd learned cut too deep for simple apologies to heal. I let the call go to voicemail and returned to my book, to the story of someone else's journey through loss toward hope. Charlie settled at my feet with a contented sigh, and the house around us felt exactly like what it had always been, a home built on love, protected by wisdom, and sustained by the quiet strength of a woman who'd finally learned her own worth. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property or objects you can hold in your hands. Sometimes it's the knowledge that you're capable of surviving betrayal, of rebuilding after destruction, of creating a life that honors your deepest values while protecting your most vulnerable places. Robert had given me that knowledge wrapped in legal documents that ensured my security, but more importantly, in the understanding that I deserved to be protected. And I'd given myself the gift of believing him, of choosing dignity over false peace, of insisting that my story would be written by me. At 55 years old, sitting in a house that was entirely mine, surrounded by the evidence of a life being rebuilt, one choice at a time, I finally understood what freedom felt like. Not the absence of responsibility or connection, but the presence of choice made from strength rather than fear. The snow kept falling outside my windows, beautiful and clean, and full of promise for the spring that would surely come. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had family members try to take advantage of you during a difficult time? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life experiences about family betrayal and finding the strength to stand up for yourself. And please share this with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve respect and protection, no matter who tries to convince them otherwise. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the people who truly love us leave us gifts that go far beyond money. They leave us the tools we need to protect ourselves and the reminder that we're worth protecting. Take care of yourselves and never let anyone convince you that you're not worthy of dignity and respect.